All right. Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're going to be
Sounds good.
focusing on the Middle East. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what happened after that latest escalation in Gaza.
Yep.
Basically, we're trying to figure out where all the different important players stand and how they're reacting to this.
Right.
To help us with this, we've got a really interesting news excerpt.
Okay.
It's focused on a conversation, a phone call, actually, between President al-Sissi of Egypt and King Abdullah II of Jordan.
Yeah.
Now, this is a fascinating
Yeah, I think so.
conversation because it really gives you a peek behind the scenes, you know?
Right, behind the curtain.
Yeah, at the diplomacy that's happening right now.
Right.
So one of the
Right,
things
to resolve this.
that's really interesting about this phone call is the timing, you know?
Yeah.
It happened right after King Abdullah met with President Trump.
Oh, wow.
So that kind of tells you right there that, you know, things are moving pretty quickly. You know, there's a sense of urgency to this.
Yeah. High-level diplomacy.
Going on. Yeah. And both leaders, al-Sissi and Abdullah, they're both really pushing for a complete ceasefire in Gaza.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense.
One thing that really caught my eye was this shared concern about the Palestinian hostages and detainees.
Right.
You know, we've seen ceasefires in this region before.
Yeah.
They can be pretty fragile.
Absolutely.
You know, they don't always hold.
Right.
So what do you think? Why is this focus on hostages and detainees so important this time around?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, you know, if we sort of step back for a second and think about it, this isn't the first ceasefire that we've seen in Gaza.
Right.
And if we're honest, the track record hasn't been great.
No.
There's been a lot of
No, it hasn't.
back and forth, you know, agreements made and then broken and, you know,
Right.
more violence.
Yeah.
So I think al-Sissi and Abdullah both understand that, you know, if hostages aren't released and if detainees aren't treated humanely, that could become very easily a flashpoint.
Right.
That could reignite the whole conflict.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So essentially they're trying to sort of learn from past mistakes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you know that this call for swift humanitarian aid delivery, it isn't just about, you know, alleviating suffering. It's also about trying to prevent further instability. You know, if people's basic needs aren't met, people become desperate. And desperation can lead to, you know, all sorts of unpredictable things.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to me how, you know, Egypt and Jordan, it seems like you're working really closely together on this, you know? What do you make of that?
Well, I think if we, you know, look back in history a little bit, you know, Egypt has a, you know, it's a major player in the region. And they have, you know, we could go all the way back to like the Camp David Accords in 1978 as a prime example of how Egyptian diplomacy can really shift the entire dynamic in the Middle East. And then Jordan, of course, you know, they have their own, you know, reasons to be involved, a very large Palestinian population. So they have a vested interest in seeing a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely.
And historically, both countries have been, you know, key mediators in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And it's interesting how they're not just focused on Gaza this time. You know, they're also, the news excerpt mentions them condemning the Israeli military actions in the West Bank as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's really significant when you think about it. You know, these are key U.S. allies in the region. Publicly criticizing Israeli actions. You know, it really shows the level of concern they have. And it puts pressure, I think, on the U.S. to really address the situation. But it's you know, it's a delicate balancing act for them, too, because on the one hand, they're doing this, but on the other hand, they're committed to working with President Trump on a peace process.
Exactly. And speaking of President Trump, I was really surprised to read that both al-Sissi and Abdullah just flat out rejected his proposal to resettle Palestinians in their countries.
That was
non-starter.
What was that all about?
Well, I mean, this goes back to, remember Trump's deal of the century?
Yeah, vaguely.
Yeah. It was a very controversial proposal that he put forward.
Right.
And essentially it suggested moving large numbers of Palestinians.
From Gaza and the West Bank into neighboring countries, including Egypt and Jordan.
Wow.
It was met with outrage from Palestinians.
Yeah.
And most of the international community saw it as just totally unrealistic and unfair.
Right.
So it's not surprising that al-Sissi and Abdullah II said no way.
Wow. So it sounds like these leaders are really walking a tightrope here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, they're trying to push for peace.
Right.
But at the same time, they're trying to maintain their relationships with the U.S. and Israel.
Exactly.
It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah.
So where does all this leave us? I mean, what about the long-term prospects for peace here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's a very complex situation.
Yeah.
I mean, you have these regional powers trying to mediate.
Yeah.
You have the U.S. pushing its own agenda.
Right.
And you have, frankly, a whole host of other international actors with their own interests. But I think the key takeaway here is that Egypt and Jordan, they're really emphasizing a two-pronged approach.
Okay.
One is addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis.
Right.
People are suffering.
Yeah.
They need help. That needs to be dealt with right away.
Absolutely.
But the other side of that coin is advocating for a long-term political solution that actually addresses the root causes of the conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But what about those other international actors you mentioned? I mean, it seems like the U.S. is so deeply involved.
Yeah.
I mean, what role can other world powers play in supporting a lasting peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I think that's something for all of us to really ponder.
Yeah.
Could the European Union exert more influence?
Right.
What about Russia?
Yeah.
What about China?
Yeah.
I mean, the Middle East is, it's a geopolitical chessboard. There are a lot of players vying for influence.
Right.
And I think it's really worth exploring how these other nations might contribute to or frankly hinder the peace process.
Wow. Yeah. Lots to think about. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I hope you all learned something interesting about this really complex situation in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.